Welcome back to the table. Today, Ryan and I are going to be giving you a look at a hotly anticipated title coming to Kickstarter. This is Call of Duty, the board game. This is going to be a preview. We're going to give you kind of an overview of what the game is doing, at least the prototype that we have. We also have some content coming very soon that is a round one that gives you a sense for how the first and maybe the first two rounds of the game plays. And we're going to be talking mostly about the sort of advanced mode of the game. There is a basic training,
sure,
no pun intended, or probably pun intended, basic training mode, which is very sort of get to know the game and the very basics. But we've kind of added everything that we've been given in the prototype here to put it through the test.
Yeah, which still isn't everything. And there is, like we said, that basic mode, because there are some interesting things happening here that you might not just automatically be familiar with, because the game tries to adapt this Call of Duty video game onto the tabletop format. And if you've been living under a rock forever,
you might not have
you
heard
might
of
not
it.
know Call of Duty, but it is a military-based shooter game that pits teams against each other. In this game, you're going to be, at least in the core box, which is what we have, it's a 1v1 experience. So we already have each team set up here, and you'll notice everything that goes along with that one team is over here on the side of the board. And you play kind of sitting across from each other, but you grab a player board, you grab a weapon, potentially some item cards, a kill streak card, and your tactical tracker, and all of that is going to come into play as you're moving around this board and effectively shooting at each other.
Yeah, and it is important to note that this doesn't just recreate the same thing that the video game recreates. It also recreates the video game itself, because there's respawning and things like that. So this will feel not only like a tactical shooter, but it'll also feel like a tactical shooter video game, because all those same sorts of things happens. You heard him mention kill streak. They even have badges, which again aren't in this, but they promise even more to sort of really connect the IP to the experience at the table.
For sure, and a lot of what you're doing in Call of Duty is abstracted here into this game, and they did it in what I would think is a pretty clever way of hidden movement, where you have actually both players are moving behind a screen. So you don't actually know where your other player is. You know maybe where you last saw them, but once they move, you have no idea where they're moving. And so there's a lot of that kind of tension that you'd find in the Call of Duty game of like checking around the corners, wondering if they're going to run around the corner the same time that you're aiming down that corner. And so all of that is happening through a programming system where you're pre-programming all of your action steps behind a screen before you would actually take any actions.
Yeah, and that screen, it's not moving. So there's no reveal in this. So, side note, play with people who don't cheat.
That should be a pretty clear statement across all games.
In all of our videos, yes. If you play with people who cheat, stop playing with them.
it.
But you're playing behind a screen, and you're going to be putting those action tokens to plot out your course. Usually, again, in this version that we have, there's 4 tokens you're going to put out, potentially, moving around the map to these different nodes. And again, once you've set all of that up and you're ready to execute, both players are effectively simultaneously going to do step 1, step 2. And at each step, you're going to check for whether or not people have some line of sight, which is effectively just across these lines, direct, connecting the nodes. Or if, say, this node has some blue lines, you could see from here to here to here. There's all these colors and all these different lines on the board that show you effectively, if I'm in this spot, here's what I have effectively line of sight to if I'm aimed in particular direction.
Yeah, and some of these locations that you can move to give you cover bonuses. Some of them give you bonuses to your accuracy, which we'll talk about. And some of them contain objectives, like this flag here that we're trying to capture. So when you're deciding to move, you're trying to kind of plot yourself into a good position where maybe you have a little cover, maybe you have some line of sight advantage, but you don't know when your opponent is going to get there. So you can do some of the things that you think about in Call of Duty, like you can camp, get your sights ready, aimed at your sights, and hope that the opponent runs through your field of vision, but they might have been going in a different direction. Now, once you do kind of plot out your movements, you can't change them. But a lot of these tokens, and you'll see here kind of just like this basic move token, a lot of them can be slotted with advanced actions as well.
Yeah, there are tokens, as you can see on my board here. I've slotted one for my third action here to use this item. And I have this sprint token here, which is one that's not going to be slotted, but it lets me move a little faster. So there are some, at least the sprints, that aren't placed in those tokens. But what you're doing on your turn, it's broken into 2 phases, basically, each round. There's the planning phase, which is where you're putting all these things behind your shield on your board. And once everyone's ready for that, you go into the action phase, like we said, where you're just one by one doing number 1, number 2, number 3. And these effects mostly are just going to be moving you around the board, and then at each stage, like we said, checking for line of sight. So as you can see here, I'm starting here, which corresponds to this location, and Ryan is starting in his location. And if we did our first move, I've got a sprint, which lets me move twice to my first node here, and then I'm going to be facing down this line.
And my first move just takes me 1 space, and I'm also facing down this line. So you'll see here, without having any idea where we're going to move, we actually did get to a spot where we could see each other.
Yeah.
And you can know that we see each other because you can trace the lines. There's a blue line and a blue line. So we are actually able to shoot at each other from this movement. This will pause the game. As soon as you get into a space after your action is resolved, where you are actually looking at each other, you go straight into combat, which I think, combat is kind of the meat and potatoes of the game. It's where you're doing a lot of the strategic planning of how you're going to be attacking the opponent.
Yeah, and combat is going to result in someone being eliminated from the board,
or
and someone probably taking a wound, or maybe both people being eliminated from the board. Like I said, it's like the video game, so it's very fast-paced. You're going to move, shoot, maybe die, come back and respawn the next round. Or you might, like this, after the very first move, get into a situation where, like, oh, we're facing each other. This is all about sort of getting into your opponent's head and figuring out what they're wanting to do, because you're going to get a point when you eliminate the other player, but you're also going to get a point, at least in this scenario, if you control the flag. So if I had first moved to the flag and taken control of it, as long as I have that control at the end of the round, I don't have to be there with my guy.
Yeah.
But as long as I have control, I'll get a point. So that's another way you could play, is just like, I'm going to go get the flag, and then I'm going to effectively run away, kind of camp out, hide, so that they don't get any points. And potentially, I have a landmine. Maybe I'll drop that near the flag, so if they try to take the flag back, no, that's not going to happen.
So let's talk about combat. Let's talk about what happens when you get into combat, because it is a pretty streamlined experience, and it's meant to represent that fast-paced shooting at each other. And this is where your tactical board and your weapon board are actually going to come into play. Your tactical board here always starts at 0 for both players, but there are several things that could change your tactics start, including whether you have any wounds, whether you're directly facing each other, whether or not you have any terrain bonuses that are going to give you a plus or minus potentially to your aim. And this is actually going to increase or decrease based on those. And this is going to contribute to the damage you're doing. So a big part of combat is trying to find ways to get that higher. Another way you're going to be doing damage is actually with your weapon itself. If you see here, each weapon has 2 little bullet holes that represent where your tracker is going to start and based on the range. So if you're 2 spaces away, we'd start here, which is kind of how we are. You want to get this tracker up as well, because you will do more damage the higher you get based on a card that you choose. And we haven't even talked about these cards yet.
No, we have a deck of cards, and everyone starts with the same cards in the basic game, and then you add a bunch more of cards to that for the advanced game. But you're going to be drawing some number of those depending on your character for your hand size. And during combat, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to place the card that you want to play sort of face down in this card slot, and take a dice pool or build a dice pool from all of the dice you have. Everyone has a bunch of dice according to their player again, and you're going to build that out of the green, the blue, and the red.
Yeah, and you're going to get to roll 7 dice, but some characters or some weapons are going to have more of one color. And these dice serve particular functions. Blue dice help you aim. That's going to get your weapon tracker up so you do more damage. The green dice are defensive, which is going to
counter that, basically.
Counter that and potentially make your opponent miss. And then the red dice are purely aggression. It's just going to increase the damage of your hit. So when you're building your dice pool and you're doing this secretly, you don't know what your opponent's going to place. If they're going to go heavy on green dice, which are defensive, you really want to go heavy on blue dice to counteract that, and vice versa. Or if you think you have a really clean shot, you might want to roll a bunch of red dice to increase your total firepower, but you don't know what your opponent's doing. So this is that mind game situation of trying to predict whether you think they're going to duck, do something defensive, whether you think they're going to just pop out and fully, go full firepower. Some of that's going to be determined based on whether you know the player.
Yeah.
Some of it's just, did you happen to get lucky with your shot?
For sure, but it is not just rolling dice and adding up numbers. There's some steps to this which are really interesting. Once everyone rolls their dice and has revealed their card, you're going to do a few different things. All these things are going to change as you go through these steps to increase this. But then everyone's going to take their aim dice, and they're going to subtract that value. They're going to subtract from that the value of the other person's defense dice, which is going to move this tracker up your weapons chart.
Or down. If your opponent rolls more defense dice than you roll aim dice, you actually drop all the way down to the black, which counts as almost a miss. You get like a grazing shot, which can be pretty bad if that happens.
Right, and then you're going to look at your card as well. This card's going to have potentially a little bonus that affects some aspect that we just talked about. But the other thing is it's going to have this damage that relates to that weapon chart. So if you've ended up moving up into the yellow or the reddish or the deep red, you're going to do more damage with your weapon from that. And then, like Ryan said, add to that all the red die values that you rolled. I found in this game, it's not you might be inclined to want to just roll a ton of red die, but if you've calculated your aim down to the point where someone reduced it to 0, the red die aren't going to help you.
Yeah, you don't even get to add them to your score. It was just a grazing shot. So there is a lot that goes into those decisions, and it's a pretty quick calculation once you get into it. You basically are just adjusting your firepower, your weapon's firepower based on those blue dice you rolled, and then, comparing it to the card, you add up your totals. Whoever does more damage wins the fight. So you don't really need to calculate damage. There's no hit points really in the game.
No.
If I did 16 total firepower and David did 12, I win the fight. And he's just eliminated, I'd score a point. Of course, you do respawn again the very next turn, so there's no real player elimination there. But it's very, very fast-paced. Somebody's going to die. If you tie, you both die.
And on top of that, if you're within close enough range, the person who survived is still going to take wounds. This is a bit of a kind of catch-up mechanic penalty, if you will, because the wounds are going to negatively affect their next combat necessarily, unless they're able to bide their time until their wounds are healed.
Yeah, and wounds can be another way to kill a player. If a player already has a wound and gets more wounds, then they will die. So this is a classic Call of Duty situation. If you throw a grenade and then get into a gunfight and you manage to wound them during the gunfight and then the grenade goes off and they die, that can happen in this game. Or like you can step on a landmine and it just does damage to everybody around you. Or you can use some of those kill strikes like we talked about, which just cause wounds, which if you're perfectly healthy, it just wounds you. But if you're already wounded, it kills you. So there's definitely a lot of different ways to kill players in this game, which, you'd expect that in a game that's based on Call of Duty for sure.
And these cards too, we'll show some right now. There's a wide variety of cards here that have the different values of that combat level depending on what your aim is. But then they also have a lot of different abilities, some of which you'll actually use and not use for the combat values at all, but use potentially for the tactic at the bottom of, because this is another action token that you can put in there. Say I want to go to this position and I really think Ryan's going to be doing this. I'm going to put this tactic in because I'm fairly certain, or at least I think, that we're going to be fighting at this moment on the board. So I might do this to increase some of my stats.
Yeah, and this tactics token is one of the only ways you can actually interrupt your programming, because if you slot this in, say for example, I had slotted this tactic in on my third action, and then when you get to that action, you'll play a tactics card, and that tactics card is going to have some kind of text that will potentially change up your programming, maybe let you use an item or move an extra space, or just something that is a little bit different. Of course, you have to have pre-slotted that in there, which means you have to have planned to use a tactics card, just like you have to plan to use items. So all of that does kind of, go into that first planning stage.
Yeah, all of the things that you would expect from a programming game are here in terms of like, okay, I planned this out meticulously. I know exactly what he's going to do. Oh, that's not at all what happened. And things go awry. Like you might get into combat right away and you didn't even expect that. Or you might have thought you were going to get in combat and he ended up going on the other side of the map. So it really kind of unfolds in an interesting way, and it all really kind of depends on what you want to happen. Like I found the more I played this, initiating contact and combat all the time is not necessarily what you want to be doing.
Sometimes you just want to camp out, and there's also...
That's how I play the normal Call of Duty too.
There's one more type of card that we didn't talk about, and these are more like persistent effects that you can play. They have a special symbol on them. You can play them during your planning phase and just hope that at some point during the planning phase, that whatever text needed on that card is triggered, and then you can use that card as well. But again, you have to predict where your opponent is going to go. Now, the last thing about combat, somebody during combat is eliminated. Now, this is another way that you can kind of change your programming. After combat, if you are still standing, you can choose to skip all the rest of the actions that you would have taken. Now, that's up to you. Sometimes it's good to take actions. It might move you into a better position. But sometimes maybe you're about to use an item or something that now you don't need, so you can actually cancel your next set of actions after the combat.
Or you might suspect that the other person just planted a mine.
Planted a landmine?
Before you took them out.
That's true. Maybe you don't want to move.
And then you might move right into the
That's
landmine.
true.
So there's a lot of head games that happen with this game for sure. So if you have any questions at all about Call of Duty, the board game, please make them in the comments below. But better yet, take a look at our round 1, because then you'll be able to see 2 rounds played in full detail with all the things going on. We're going to play it with all of the advanced materials that we have right here. But like I said, if you have any questions, make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.